welcome. Thank you for your patience in our start, and thanks for climbing the stairs to the Best Buy Theater. I'm Jennifer Gunn. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and I'd like to welcome you to our first IAS Thursday of the semester. And I'd like to open this by acknowledging that the University of Minnesota is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota land, was ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. And the IAS acknowledges that this place has a complex and layered history. This land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and with each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. I want to make a few announcements before I turn the program over to our speakers. And the first is to say that for anybody who is interested in applying for an interdisciplinary doctoral fellowship at the IAS, the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Global Change, the Consortium for the Study of the Pre-Modern World, the Minnesota Population Center, or the Life Course Center. We will be having an info session next Wednesday from 12 to 1 in that open area on the west side of the first floor of Wilson Library. So feel free to come, bring your lunch. We will provide beverages. Next week, our talk will be Fayola Jacobs, a new faculty member in the Humphrey School, who will be talking about grasping at the root, intersectionality, and environmental justice. So we'll look for you at 3:30 next Thursday, but downstairs. Oh, it'll also be in Best Buy. Sorry about that. In the same time, same place. We'll see you then. It's my great pleasure to introduce Tracy Deutsch and Rachel Sherman, who have done the heavy lifting for this talk today. Tracy is an associate professor in the Department of History and the Imagine Fund Chair for Thinking Food. And Rachel Sherman is professor of global studies and sociology. And I'll turn the program over to them now. Thanks.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So thank you all for coming out this afternoon and for joining us for this talk. I know the start of the semester is an especially hectic time, and it's so nice and so important at this time to have this space. I think of talks like this as an oasis in the busyness of the early weeks. I want to say that it's especially striking to me that this book, authored by 3 sociologists, has brought people together from across the university. I think that says good things about this book and the talk that we're going to hear. And I also think it says good things about the food studies and public health work that is happening at the university and our realization that solving problems of food insecurity and injustice will take all of our ideas and all of our energy. I'm grateful to all the institutions at this university that create encounters like this, and specifically the ones that brought these authors to be with us today. For today's talk, our support comes from, obviously, the Institute for Advanced Study, who really did all the heavy lifting to make this happen. I want to also especially thank Brianna and Hannah, the staff members who did the logistics of this. Funding was also provided by the Healthy Foods, Healthy Lives Institute, the Obesity Prevention Center, the Program in Health Disparities, the Departments of Sociology and Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, the Thinking Food Imagine Chair and Office of the Provost, the Interdisciplinary Collaborative Workshop on Feminist Food Studies, and the College of Liberal Arts. Finally, I want to especially call out my partner in crime, Rachel Sherman, who gamely stepped in when I had this idea last spring and stuck through the planning process even when we weren't entirely sure of the timeline. Her work has really been crucial to bringing us all together. Most of all, I want to thank our wonderful speakers who came from their warmer climates to Minnesota and will present their work and then leave time for your questions. I'm going to present them alphabetically, which reflects the ways that they list their authorship and their own insistence on collaborative equity. And I think that kind of speaks to the ways that this book has many things to teach us, and the importance of collaboration is one of them. Sarah Bowen is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at North Carolina State University. Her areas of research include the sociology of food, health and inequality, political economy, and methodology. Her first book was entitled Divided Spirits, Tequila, Mezcal, and the Politics of Production. She has also published extensively on the discursive and environmental pressures around feeding children and infants, factors that shape low-income women's food shopping, and globalization and commodity chains. Her research has been supported by the USDA and the Centers for Disease Control. And I'm just gonna say quickly, when you're introducing 3 people, you have to compress even more than you normally would. So just know that behind every sentence that I say are like billions of articles. Joslyn Brenton is an assistant professor of sociology at Ithaca College, where her focus is health, illness, and the gendered and racial inequities around these. In addition to this book, she has written about parenting strategies of low-income mothers and women's food work, and along with these co-authors, has written pieces for The Guardian and National Geographic on food as a human right and on rethinking home cooking. Sinikka Elliot, in the center, is an associate professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia, where she researches and teaches on the family, social inequality, and social policy. She has a body of work on parenting and sexuality education, including the book Not My Kid, What Parents Believe About the Sex Lives of Their Teenagers. Another body of work on the parenting practices by single Black mothers of their adolescent children in the context of carceral politics and neoliberalism, and this body of work on feeding and health practices. I should add, she's also written widely on sociological methods and the public discourse around Black single mothers. Her work has been funded by the Russell Sage Foundation, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. The book we are here to discuss today is called Pressure Cooker: Why Home Cooking Won't Solve Our Problems and What We Can Do About It. It has been, for lack of a better word, a sensation. In addition to academic reviews, it has been covered widely in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Slate, The Guardian, PBS. The day that a friend of mine forwarded me an article about the book, another friend called me on the phone and said, "Have you heard about this book, Pressure Cooker?" It has jump-started conversations in the public media about eating and the politics of housework. And I think it also raises questions for all of us about how we theorize food work, and the importance of these to families and households. So I look forward to hearing more about the work and to the conversation that comes out of it. I don't want to talk more about the book. I'll turn it over to the authors. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you all for being here today. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, doing good. Okay. So before we get started, we would like to say thank you to some folks who made this possible. So we'd like to thank Tracy Deutsch, Rachel Sherman, and Ann Meyer for inviting us here and for hosting us. We'd also like to say thank you to the list of folks who co-sponsored this event, as well as Karen Kinoshita, Hannah Baxter, and Brianna Menning for helping to organize the event. And thank you all for coming today. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for conversation and questions from you all. The book is equally authored, and we followed a similar process in preparing for this talk, so we are going to co-present today. So why are we writing about food and the family meal? Well, there's a growing sense among many that something is deeply wrong with our relationship to food. People worry about rising rates of obesity and diabetes, unpronounceable ingredients in our food, that the lettuce you buy at the grocery store may kill you, and folks are also worried about how industrial food production is contributing to climate change. And there's also alarm about the amount of time that Americans spend cooking, especially the decline in home cooking that we've been seeing since 1965. So between 1965 and 2008, women have cut the amount of time they spend cooking in half. And in recent years, men, we've seen an uptick in the amount of time they spend cooking, but they haven't stepped in to replace women's cooking labor. So in this context, cooking has become a political act and an issue of morality. Spending the time and energy to make a home-cooked meal, especially one with whole ingredients and from scratch, is seen as a vote against an unsustainable industrial food system and a way to keep our families safe, healthy, and together. And food pundits argue that families need to get back to cooking and that, frankly, they have little excuse for not doing so. Farmer author Joel Salatin argues that our techno-enabled kitchens, quote, allow busy people to cook from scratch and eat with integrity far easier than during great-grandma's time. She had to fetch water from the well, split stove wood, start a fire, and churn the butter, and still she managed to feed a large family very well. Salatin concludes, if our generation can't do at least as well as great-grandma with our 40-hour work week and kitchen tech, then we deserve to eat adulterated pseudo-food that sends us to an early grave. He feels very strongly about this. So this was from an article that Salatin wrote in 2014 in response to an article we wrote and published in the ASA journal Context. The title of our article was called The Joy of Cooking, and that's the article out of which this book emerged. And Salatin was reacting to our argument that we really need to think outside of the kitchen when considering how to address problems with our food system. Chef activist Jamie Oliver echoes many of the same sentiments in his popular TED Talk, which has over 9 million views. Oliver paces the stage. He throws his hands in the air, proclaiming that we're experiencing nothing short of a catastrophe in the United States with 3 generations of people who haven't learned to cook. And Oliver says, the home needs to start passing on cooking skills again. If you can cook, money doesn't matter. If you can cook, time doesn't matter. Au contraire, Jamie Oliver. And messages urging Americans to do better by their children are ubiquitous, and many focus on food. So while we were in the middle of doing this research for the book, we came across newspaper articles like this one in the Washington Post, which declares the most important thing you can do with your kids, eat dinner with them. And this article cites numerous studies that find that kids who dine with their folks are healthier, they're better students, they're better behaved, they're less likely to engage in risky behaviors like smoking or doing drugs. However, the statistics actually aren't that clear. Just in the past few years, several studies, including some by Ann Meyer in the sociology department here, have challenged the notion that family dinners are solely responsible for these outcomes. And we're happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. So in this context, expert and foodie advice present home cooking and family dinners as the key to producing healthy and happy children, making the production of the family meal a moral imperative. It is what good families do. And much of this advice is premised on the idea that modern families simply aren't prioritizing the family meal or that they don't really understand what healthy cooking is. Yet few studies have actually asked the people primarily responsible for feeding children, namely women and mothers, about their experiences trying to feed their families. So this prompted us to ask, how are diverse families managing these expectations and with what consequences? So we spent 5 years researching this question, and we detail the findings in our new book. So while there's a considerable amount of survey research on what households eat and who's doing the cooking and the grocery shopping, there isn't, at the time at least, there wasn't a whole lot of research that was looking at the closer day-to-day details of what it takes to put a meal on the table. So our analysis comes from in-depth interviews that we conducted with 168 mothers, as well as ethnographic observations with 12 of the families in our study. And this was a multi-year project. So in 2012 and early 2013, we interviewed over 150 mothers and a handful of grandmothers who are the primary caregivers of young children. So sitting on their couches or at their kitchen tables, we asked them to tell us what their experiences are like. What do your children eat? Who shops for the food? Who makes the food? Who cleans up afterwards? What do you think of as an ideal meal? And the majority of participants, about 138, were from poor and working class families, and another 30 participants were from middle and upper class families. We also wanted to get a sense not just of what people are telling us they do, but what are they doing in their homes when we're not there? So we asked them if we could come to their homes. And so the following year, we invited 12 lower income families to participate in extended ethnographic observations. We spent over 250 total hours with this smaller group of 12 families. We tagged along to the grocery store. We went with them to the doctor's office, to WIC appointments, and we hung out in their homes with them as they prepared and ate meals. So all of the families in this book live in and around the Raleigh area, which is a place of stark and persistent inequalities when it comes to food and the economy. Raleigh is a place where you can find on one corner hipster food trucks and artisanal donut shops. And at the same time that we were right in the middle of our research, the only large supermarket in one of the low-income neighborhoods closed, leading to news reports that a food desert had emerged in downtown Raleigh. And like many places in the United States, Raleigh is filled with food pantries that can't meet demand. And there are many, many folks in Raleigh who can't regularly afford to buy the food they need. I should also note that our project has a substantial participatory community-based outreach component, and we're also happy to speak about that in the Q&A section. So in this talk, we'll outline some of the findings we write about in Pressure Cooker, the book, which came out in March, challenges the common sense idea that family meals can solve some of our most pressing social problems. In the book, we introduce readers to 9 women and their families, and their stories are really a stark illustration of how far removed from people's lives this foodie advice is. I want to make a note that on the following slides, you're going to see photos of people. These are not the real families in our study. We've chosen these pictures to represent these families' struggles, their issues, and also their demographics. All names are pseudonyms, and they've been created to protect families' identities. So in the book, we analyze 7 foodie maxims, exploring how they resonate or don't resonate in the lives of the women who were in our study and their families. So we're going to focus on 3 of these maxims today. Make time for food, shop smarter, eat better, and know what's on your plate. So the first one I want to talk about is this idea of make time for food. And popular discourse is that families actually do have time for food. We'll hear this a lot. You just need to prioritize. The time is there if you make it. But despite public panic that Americans have forgotten how to cook, more than half of U.S. families make a home-cooked meal almost every night of the week, and more than 1/3 families cook at home between 2 and 5 times per week. So it's only a small percentage of families that aren't cooking that often at home. Also, contrary to the popular notion that poor people in particular don't make time for food, people with a household income under 130% of the poverty line are more likely to cook at home every night. And they also consume less fast food than middle class families. And so we're happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So I want to briefly introduce you to one family in our study that made a lot of time for food. Although, as you'll see, making time for food didn't necessarily solve their problems. Rosario Garcia and her family are one of the 9 families featured in the book. Rosario and her husband Samuel are immigrants from Mexico. At the time we met them, they'd been living in the United States for about 10 years, and all 3 of their children were born in the United States. During our study, Samuel worked for a landscaping company, but the work was sporadic, and so to pick up some extra cash, Rosario babysat her neighbor's children. She would resell toys and clothes at the local flea market, and she would make tamales that were revered in her neighborhood, and she would sell those to some of the neighbors. But mostly Rosario thought of herself as a mother, and she spent a huge amount of time cooking. She would wake up early, and she would get pots of food and soup simmering so that it could cook all day long. And she prepared 2 and sometimes 3 different meals for her family to sort of accommodate her husband and her children's preferences. Rosario grew her own chilies and herbs in a garden alongside her house so that she could make her dishes the traditional way. And she believed it was important to make her tortillas from scratch rather than buying them from the store. In fact, she told us she often would refer to other Latina immigrants who bought pre-made tortillas as lazy. And so despite these efforts, food fights were common in the Garcia household, and we saw some of those food fights take place. Rosario's children were gravitating towards the American fare that they ate at school: hot dogs, hamburgers, pizza. And as Rosario explained, sometimes they say, "Mom, we don't want you to make this because I don't like it. Take my son. When I make pozole, he thinks it's spicy, but it's not." And this was the source of a lot of the food fights in the Garcia household. Jennifer Van Hook and other sociologists have found that immigrant children solidify an American identity by doing things like learning English and adopting American eating habits and food preferences. They find that immigrant parents often find themselves swimming upstream when it comes to getting their children to like and to eat foods from their home country. And this is what we saw with Rosario. She was making time for food, but her kids often just refused to eat the food that she made. She was in the kitchen, she was cooking, she had an identity as a stay-at-home mother, but her family still wasn't always eating the way she wanted. And I'll turn things over to Sinikka, Elliot.
Thank you, Joslyn. So Rosario was one of the mothers in our study who was making a lot of time for food. Many of the mothers in our study, though, depended on jobs with non-standard and unstable hours. Making time for food was incredibly difficult for them. And this rise in precarious employment, so you might have heard of this term, this is employment that's uncertain, it's unpredictable, it's risky. Think of contract work, but also you can think of low-wage work. This rise in precarious employment in the US has especially affected low-wage workers. And a recent article has noted that precarious jobs are associated with psychological distress, poor sleep quality, unhappiness, and this is even above and beyond low wages. Precarious jobs include many people who work in the fast food industry. Ashley Taylor and her husband Marquand both worked at Wendy's, not McDonald's, although they worked in different locations. During the time we spent with them, we witnessed just how hard it was for them to find time for dinner. They couldn't even predict from day to day when they would be home. Ashley said, "I try to cook around my schedule, or when Marquand gets home, if we even eat. Because sometimes I get home tired and I don't eat. So I'll just fix something small for the kids." In fact, research tells us that when it comes to time, the amount of time we have doesn't matter as much as the control we have over that time. Ashley relied on family members for transportation, for childcare, and this was very complicated because they all had shift jobs as well. And she had virtually no control over her work schedule. So this was pretty chaotic. And in and around all of this, Ashley was prioritizing her children's development. So when she wasn't working, you could find her sitting crisscross applesauce on the floor with her kids doing flashcards. And this reflects another important shift in how Americans spend their time. Expectations around what good parents, and especially good mothers, do for and with their children have really ramped up. So this means that even parents with predictable schedules and resources, a lot of resources, struggle to find balance. Greeley Jansen was one of the middle-class mothers we feature in the book. She described her family's typical day as going full tilt from the moment her feet hit the ground in the morning. Greeley was getting her own business off the ground, and she was putting in long hours. Her husband, Matt, an accountant, often had to stay late at work. Like many professionals, they experienced the problem of overwork that we see common today. Their daughter had regular after-school activities, another important part of middle-class childhood today. In the midst of all of this, Greeley Jansen was committed to having her family sit down to not just one meal a day, but two, breakfast and dinner. And she packed special lunches for her daughter to take to school, like homemade sushi, really fancy things. Food mattered to Greeley. It mattered a lot. But she also expressed a sense of exhaustion about it all. When it's so compressed after a stressful day, cooking is kind of horrible, she told us in a confessional tone. She also worried about depriving her daughter of attention. She said, I want to be able to sit down and help her with her homework or help her finish her Valentine's for her classmates. Instead, she was in the kitchen cooking. So this dilemma that Greeley faced is very common today. American mothers, this might not be that surprising, but they have far less free time today than they did in 1965. But in 1965, we kind of think of American mothers as intensively cultivating their children, being there, taking care of their kids. But in fact, American mothers today spend more time with their children than do those mothers in the 60s. So Greeley was making time for food, and then some. But it meant that she had to make sacrifices in other parts of her life that she valued, such as being an involved mother. Okay, so another foodie edict that we take on is this idea that if you just shop smarter, you can eat better. And we really don't mean to throw Jamie Oliver under the bus in this talk, but he does have some gems out there that make it a little bit easier to do that. So, of course, this idea of shopping smarter to eat better is really exemplified in this quote. And this is from Jamie Oliver's tour around the U.S. when he went into lower-income families' homes and critiqued what they were eating. So the idea is if you can afford that big TV, you can afford to eat better than you are. And to be fair to Jamie Oliver, this idea has been around for a long time. So more than 100 years ago, in the 1900s, early 1900s, food costs were rising. But the dominant discourse at the time was that women shoppers were responsible for their families' stretched food budgets. So, for example, the president of the National Housewives League said the problem was women's ignorance of market conditions, their naive trust of grocers, and their laziness. And we have the University of Minnesota historian Tracy Deutsch to thank for that historical gem. So today, the image of the efficient housewife is alive and well. Sociologists Shelley Koch and others document that consumers are expected to be rational and efficient with their time and their money, to adopt strategies like clipping coupons, I'm sure you've heard of this, shopping sales, leaving the kids at home to avoid unnecessary purchases. All right, so this is a very rational, efficient idea of shopping. But no amount of smart shopping can make up for just not having enough money. Okay. So Leanne Armstrong worked at McDonald's, but like many low-wage workers, she relied on food stamps to feed her children. On the day she planned to go grocery shopping, there was a crisis. Her food stamps hadn't gotten transferred because of an administrative glitch. She only had $30 in the bank, and the cupboards were empty. Luckily, it was payday, so Leanne made a plan. She's like, I'm going to go to McDonald's, pick up my paycheck, cash it, and buy food. She deliberated out loud about what she would do with the money on the way to the bank to cash the check. The choices were stark. She was delinquent on a bill, but they needed to eat. It's pay this bill or else let them take me to court. I should let them take me to court, right? Leanne asked her mother, because we really need groceries. Her mother urged her in her mother's larger-than-life way, let them take you to court. Tell them you have 3 children to feed. Girl, do you know how far behind I am on medical bills? You can't get blood out of a turnip. So she was a very big character. Every day in the United States, families are forced to make these kinds of hard decisions, fall behind on rent, ignore medical bills, or let the cupboards go empty. And a number of studies have shown that food shortages, sometimes called food insecurity, as I'm sure you know, often go hand in hand with other forms of hardship, such as not being able to meet medical or housing costs. Food insecurity is also linked to racial inequality and racism. 22% of Black households are food insecure compared to less than 9% of white households. And a recent study found that people who reported experiencing racial discrimination were almost 2 times as likely to also report experiencing food insecurity. Leanne looked for the best deals, but her efforts were ultimately rendered obsolete when things beyond her control wreaked havoc on her budget. She had no financial safety net, and this is partly by design. In order to qualify for food stamps, you have to prove that you don't have too many financial assets. And Leanne wasn't alone. So over the course of our study, one of the families featured in the book was evicted, and this is a widespread problem in the United States. Patricia Washington, her daughter Sandra, and Sandra's 2 young children were living in a hotel room during the time we spent with them. They had been evicted when they couldn't keep up with the rent and the heating costs. So in the hotel room, they had a microwave, they had a hot plate, and they had a small fridge. And so their story really helps us to see how this assumption that if you just shop better, you shop smarter, you can eat better, makes a lot of assumptions. So for example, the argument you periodically may see, buy a whole chicken, chop it up so you can use every part, and you can eat well on a budget. Maybe you've heard that. I have. This makes a lot of assumptions about people's kitchens, their kitchen tools, and their living situation. Patricia necessarily had to buy a lot of pre-made foods because she didn't have a kitchen. Cooking in the poorly ventilated hotel room, which she did at times, made it smell. It was next to impossible to wash dishes in the tiny sink, and doing so in the bathtub was awkward and messy. So processed and microwavable foods are more expensive than raw ingredients. So Patricia's food stamps, which with no cash income were all she had to buy food, didn't go as far as they might have otherwise. And the stores, this is really crucial, the stores that she could get to from the hotel didn't have the sales or the range of products that she would prefer. And she couldn't stock up if there was a sale because she didn't have any room for it. Most of their possessions were also in this hotel room with them. So she said, right now we're in this situation. We got to eat like maybe 2 days worth. When we had the apartment, we used to go to Sam's to buy food wholesale. So as research has shown, and as Patricia Washington's story really reveals, it's expensive to be poor. And so the poor are often stigmatized and shamed for their poverty as well. And we see this loud and clear in the discourse and debates around food assistance programs, like food stamps. So on the one hand, we hear critics saying that food stamps shouldn't be used for unhealthy food purchases, things like soda, because we shouldn't use governmental resources to support people's bad decisions. But they also say that food stamps shouldn't be wasted on so-called luxury items. And we have seen in the past few years state bills, so far unsuccessfully, being introduced to ban or prohibit the use of food stamps from being used to buy things like steaks or lobster. There have also been experimental studies done that show that Americans negatively view people who use food stamps to buy organic food. To buy organic food, if you're using food stamps, you're seen as a less moral person. But when you use your, quote, own money to buy organic food, you're seen as a more moral person. Americans positively view people in that category. So there's a lot of judgment around what people buy with their food stamps. So Tara Foley was a single mother of 2, and she relied on food stamps to feed her household. Picking out a party-sized frozen lasagna and a bag of garlic bread after a long grocery shopping trip involving 2 different stores. She said, "When it's gloomy and rainy like this, I just want to throw something in the oven to relax," suggesting to us that there was some self-consciousness, or potentially she felt the need to justify this purchase. And we noticed the ways Tara was surveilled when she grocery shopped, and not just by us, the researchers. For example, Tara often used the self-check so she could monitor the total and decide what, if anything, she needed to leave behind at the store. At one store, we observed a grocery store clerk stand directly behind Tara, watching her check out. And the clerk wasn't there to be helpful because, in fact, Tara asked her a question and she ignored her. it was clear that the clerk was there to surveil Tara. And this was something that she obviously noticed herself. When we got outside the store, she exclaimed, "Damn, did she have to eyeball me the whole time?" So this idea that if we just shop smarter, we can eat better really misses the realities of many people's lives. It misses the stigma and shame around food assistance in poverty. And research tells us that stigma itself is bad for our health. It misses the challenges of feeding a family without a kitchen. And it misses the sacrifices families are making every day to feed children. Let Sarah take over.
I'm going to talk about one final foodie edict. So we're going to complicate the idea that you should know what's on your plate. And the idea behind this is simple and I think appealing, that we can work towards healthier bodies and a healthier planet by paying attention to the food we put in our grocery carts and on our plates. And this has, I think, led to important changes in the food system. But at the same time, when shopping for food is a sign of good parenting and ethical consumption, it also becomes a test of who is and who is not caring and thoughtful. And this judgment is gendered. There was a recent experimental study, and they found that Americans judged mothers, but not fathers, on the health value of their consumption choices. So mothers especially are expected to take responsibility for making healthy food choices, and they face greater social costs when they don't meet these ideals. And the moms in our study expressed a lot of anxiety about getting it right. So this was the case for Marta Hernandez Boynton, who was a middle-class mother of two. She worked in the health field, and she put a ton of time and energy into feeding her two sons and trying to stay up on the latest nutrition research. She felt very strongly that people need to know what's on their plate. But it turns out that staying on top of the nutrition research can mean it's complicated. There's a lot of information out there, sometimes contradictory, and it's sometimes hard to know what is the right direction. So Marta said, I think it's hard to be a parent in general because everything has changed so much with nutrition. Like one day it's good to do this, and one day it's good to do that. But Marta was committed to trying. She planned their weekly meals in advance, and she even got her boys involved in cooking because she hoped that then they would take an interest in the food. But despite all of her efforts, her oldest child, Sebastian, just wanted to eat the same three things over and over and over again, until she resorted to a timeless parenting strategy, bribery. So she said, I would say, I need you to try just a little bit of everything, and there's really not going to be any dessert if I feel like you're not trying. In Martha's case, she found herself doing things that she herself, as one of the experts, knew weren't ideal. Kids are active in making food decisions, and they sometimes, you might say often, thwart their parents' efforts. And we saw that over and over again. Parents don't always have complete control over feeding. Know-how also didn't help Ray Donahue, who was a middle-class mother of one. She had grown up eating soul food, and she still loved it. As a self-identified Black woman from the South, she saw soul food as a really important part of African-American history. But she also viewed it as partially responsible for the health problems confronting many of the people in her family. But she described her dilemma. There's nowhere I can go and say, okay, this person eats like I eat, and they're healthy, so let me follow this person to see what they're doing, because they seem to know what they're doing. They're not going to tell me to eat mustard on asparagus or something like that. Despite our diverse population, the United States has yet to truly embrace diverse definitions of healthy eating. The foods that Ray had identified as healthy, like asparagus and broccoli, are foods that are stereotypically associated with white diets. And we also realized as we were searching for images for this presentation that if you Google family meals, you can find relatively diverse pictures of different kinds of families eating dinner. But the food is almost always exactly the same. It's always chicken and a green salad or a green vegetable. So this is the dominant image about what it means to eat a healthy meal, apparently, in the United States. Knowing what's on your plate is not the same thing as wanting to eat it. and the food choices we make are connected not just to health and nutrition, but to histories and identities and inequalities. And then finally, know-how, knowing the nutritional content of the foods you put on your plate doesn't help if you can't afford the food. So almost all of the poor and working class moms in our study talked about the high price of healthy food and how a lot of them talked about how they try to force their concerns about health and nutrition and even safety of some of the foods that they fed their kids to go in one ear and out the other because they couldn't afford to do it differently. Melanie Richards was one of these mothers. She budgeted $300 in food stamps a month to get groceries for her family of 5, which was Melanie, her husband, her mom, and then their 2 kids. She asked, how do you do it? You shop cheaply. You buy the store brands. We buy necessities. You don't buy extra stuff. But feeding a family on $75 a week is difficult. It involves making a lot of trade-offs. When Melanie was asked if her family would eat differently if they had more money, she said, absolutely. If we could afford to buy things that were organic with less hormones, we would. And Melanie's not alone. Actually, if you look at interest in buying organic, poor, middle class, and wealthy Americans have similar levels of interest, but it's just the wealthier families that are actually buying it. Melanie never missed a moment to impart some sort of nutritional lesson to her kids. She knew what she wanted to put on her plate, but she couldn't afford to make it happen. So how do we bring this all together? Where do we go from here? We start by saying that we can't keep asking people to do better, and that trying to solve these real environmental and social problems that we see in the food system by demanding that people go back to the kitchen is unrealistic. Instead, we need to change the way we think about food. And there are different levels at which we can enact this change in our homes, in our communities, and in the nation. So the first one, at home, let it go. We need to uncouple the package deal that links good mothering, especially, with preparing wholesome family dinners from scratch. This is a difficult standard to achieve, especially when few families have ever resembled the iconic Leave It to Beaver family from the 50s. Families in the US are actually spending quite a bit of time cooking, and there are some studies that came out a few years ago that suggest that people are actually cooking more today than they were 10 years ago. But the women in our study felt a sense of inadequacy and anxiety about cooking and a sense that there was never enough time for them to do it the right way. So cooking matters, but we need to avoid the trap of believing that dinner time itself is what's going to cause or prevent kids from being happy or healthy. So the second thing is that we need to be able to allow food to mean different things to different people. So we should be able to celebrate the meaning of food, both in our families and in our cultures, while also acknowledging that often the process of getting dinner on the table takes a lot of time and it's not that rewarding. We should be able to work to try to get our kids to eat their vegetables without at the same time demonizing certain foods. And we can work hard to master our grandma's recipe for enchiladas or chicken pot pie or lasagna, and also appreciate that some days the convenience of being able to put a frozen pizza in the oven and then just get it out 15 minutes later is some pretty amazing technology. So instead of insisting on this universal definition of what it means to eat healthy or eat well, we should recognize that our beliefs about food are rooted in our own family histories and our particular social contexts. So now at the community level, what can we do? So it takes a lot of labor to get dinner on the table. So can we make it possible for families to enjoy a meal at the end of the day without expecting all of the work of creating that meal to happen just in the kitchen? So for families that have money, the market has already come up with lots of answers. You can have your groceries delivered to your door. You can buy dinner to heat up at Whole Foods, or you can use meal kits that take all of the stress out of meal planning. But these options are not affordable to everyone, so we need collective solutions that will benefit people across the income spectrum. So some of these would have to come from the government. For example, school lunch does not need to be a source of inequality and stress for parents as it was for so many of the families in our study. Universal free school lunch made with diverse recipes and with whole foods would go a long way to nourishing kids in the middle of the day. It's not just at the government level, though. Local governments and businesses can contribute to collective solutions. So schools and daycares and churches could share their commercial kitchens to help fill the cooking gap at more affordable prices. And then community dinners, which a lot of the families in our study went to, at least sometimes, they not only give people a chance to not have to cook at the end of the day, which I think is a pretty good excuse in itself, but also the chance to sit down at a table and eat with people that might have a different perspective from you. And then finally, at the national level. So the two things we focus on are, first, make food a human right. So 1 out of 8 Americans does not have enough food to eat, and many more do not have enough money to regularly afford healthy food. But in spite of all of this, we keep debating again and again whether, for example, people who use food stamps are deserving. So we need to reframe at a fundamental level the way that we think about food, not as a privilege that should be dispensed by charities to people that deserve it, but as a fundamental right for everyone. So this would mean asking, are our policies reducing food insecurity? The government started measuring food insecurity in a systematic way in the mid-90s, and there has been no real measurable improvement in that time. So if we're going to reduce food insecurity, we need to tackle the underlying conditions that cause poverty, and we need to strengthen our existing food assistance program, which should be available to everyone who needs them. Instead, there continue to be these proposals to restrict eligibility to SNAP or food stamps. So the one that's out right now, that's a big one, is with proposed changes to what they call categorical eligibility. And this could result in 9% of households across the U.S. losing their food stamps. And in states that are more generous than the average, which includes Minnesota and Wisconsin, it could be more like 15% of households who could lose their SNAP benefits. So first, we need to strengthen SNAP instead of allowing it to continue to be eroded. And second, we need to address poverty at a more fundamental level. So we need to raise the minimum wage so that working families can afford the food they need, and invest in affordable housing, given the links between housing insecurity and food insecurity. And we also need to confront and challenge racism and xenophobia directly. As Sinikka mentioned, we know that discrimination itself is linked to food insecurity, and these also prevent us from banding together to push for the kind of collective solutions that could help everyone. And then the final proposal that we have is about supporting families. So caring for others is obviously a vital part of what families do, but it's also vital to society. Countries that recognize and value care work create public policies to support it. So this looks different in different places. But countries with strong family policies, they often offer paid family leave, paid sick and vacation leave, subsidized preschool, and universal health care, none of which we have here in the US. And the benefits of living in a country that actually supports families are impressive. So there was a recent cross-national study. They found that, this is probably not surprising to most of the parents in the room, in general, parents were less happy than non-parents. So there's a happiness gap for parents. But they found that the happiness gap between non-parents and parents was the biggest in the United States, and that most of this gap was explained by variations in social policy. So parents in the US really feel like they're doing it alone, because they are. And as a society, we have to recognize that people cannot do the important work of raising the next generation by themselves. What happens in families may feel private and personal, but the fact that these families are struggling with such similar woes, time deficits, a lack of money, picky eaters, health concerns, are evidence that these are not just private troubles, but public issues that demand collective responses. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for some questions, and I'll let you all field your questions. And try to keep your questions kind of short, because we're going to ask the speakers to repeat your question to make sure everybody can hear it.
I had a question about context, social context. What do you know about the expectations of other live-in spouses, partners maybe grandparents come into the story too within reach.
Great, thanks. So the question is about context. What do we know about the role of spouses and partners in families? And then also, what do we know about people's own food histories with their families?
Shall I start? Okay. It's a great question. So we got to know these families very well. We spent over 5 years following a large group of families and then focused intensively on 12 in particular. So it really varied. In most of the households in the study, partners were not active in helping with the food work and the provisioning. And we saw a few strategies occurring in some instances. There was an assumption that male partners weren't responsible for this work. And so women by default, yes, thank you. I was thinking of default, a great writer on food and family. So women by default were often doing this work because it was assumed that it was their job. And we also saw male partners resisting their female partners' efforts to get them more involved in the food work. So even just saying, can you help me put these groceries away? You eat most of that food anyway, and walking out. And we saw male partners helping, and this is what the research shows, that we see an uptick in men's cooking, but this tends to be more for pleasure or helping around the sides than it is actually replacing women's cooking labor in the heterosexual household. And so that might be firing up the barbecue on the weekends, or it might be helping with the grocery shopping. The Taylors grocery shopped together at Ashley's insistence, but Marquand was really disengaged from the shopping trip, and his main job seemed to be to push the cart. And so, and he in fact had asked her to be more systematic in the shopping so it wouldn't take so long. So there was a sense that it wasn't really his responsibility, although he would help out. And this is what research is showing, that men are more able to organize cooking to fit their own schedule and for a leisure activity. And I will say that all of our families, bar for one, identified as heterosexual, those who had 2 people in the household. And so I'm speaking specifically to this kind of heterosexual falling back on gender roles that we saw occurring. And do you want to add to the second one?
Yeah, just briefly about their family, their parents. One thing that we noticed was that that most of the mothers, when they talked about their own views about food, they talked about their own mothers, both in good ways and bad ways. And for the mothers that had grown up experiencing food insecurity themselves in particular, that really motivated how they fed their own kids. And Tara was an example of that. And she talked about how, because she had not grown up with what she felt like was a supportive mother, she wanted to be a different kind of mother, including making full course meals. But sometimes that also, but food insecurity also interfered with people's feeding efforts. And there have been some studies by psychologists that have found that when people are food insecure as children, it affects the way they relate to food, the way they eat, and even their hunger cues, like into adulthood. So we saw that as a thread through a lot of these families' lives.
So I'm curious about the generalizability of your findings and the implications of that for your argument. What differences do you think that you might have found or you might find in the future if you conducted this study in rural areas versus urban or other areas and regions of the United States?
Good question. So the question is about generalizability. And so one of the ways we tried to make sure that we got at that was that we did conduct this study in an urban area, a rural area, and an area that kind of was like a nice combination of these two right in between, because we wanted to try to understand what is it like for folks who are living in a rural area, perhaps, many, many miles away from the grocery store. What are their experiences trying to feed their families versus somebody in a more urban area where they might live a little bit closer to a grocery store or have access to public transportation. So, with any qualitative study, even though this was a well thought out study and extensive and rigorous in its methodology, you can't take the experiences of 138, mothers over 5 years and say, okay, this is what the entire population experiences. But I think one of the things that we're struck by is that everything that we're finding in our study and that we present in the book, this is supported by larger scale studies out there. And we're able to add a little bit more nuance to those studies. So we also found that many people in our homes, like these national statistics, like they are spending a lot of time cooking. And so I think sort of that's the value of qualitative research, and that sort of adds even more value to it, is when you sort of compare it and contrast it with these larger scale studies and you're saying, okay, we're finding a lot of the same things. And I think that other folks who are interested in doing this kind of work, they can take our methods, right, and some of our findings, and they can try to replicate this in some way, or try to do this in a different area, do it on the West Coast, right, or do it in another country, and compare and contrast what they find with what we found.
The study was funded by the USDA, and a lot of their grants, they cannot be just research. So this one was technically half research, half extension. And although extension is not usually sort of participatory community-based work, that was the kind of extension work that we did. So we did asset mapping workshops in all of the communities. We had 3 counties, and they're sort of like focus groups where you bring people together, but instead of saying, let's talk about food deserts or the problems, food poverty in this county, you talk about the assets that you have and what's already happening here and how you can work together. So we started with sort of that kind of food assessment, and then we funded mini grants for the duration of the study. So these were very small grants, under $2,000, that were funding. A lot of them were in churches, especially in the rural counties, because those were sort of the main organizations that were in these counties, but also nonprofits, neighborhood groups. We intentionally made the application process easy so that you didn't have to be a big established organization with grant writing experience. And so those funded things like, they funded church gardens. They funded, one church had a Zumba class it was 60 or 80 people every week, and it was just $1. They did walking trails. We had a small skate park in Raleigh, all sorts of things. But so the project had that component, and that took a lot of time and honestly money. But I think it had some value. And one thing was that the mothers told us, and we had kind of a community parties at the end, and they said that they appreciated that we weren't just studying these places, but also supporting them, or trying to support them at least.
Yeah, I still remember going to an interview in the 3rd year of this study, and the participant brought out a newsletter that we were sending to our participants every 3 months, and said, when you first approached me, I thought, I don't know about you guys, but I really think it's cool what's happening in my community, and I really appreciate the work that you all are doing, and I thought that was important. And we also really used the research to inform some of the community organizing, and so that was also important to us. That's why we call it Voices into Action. So the research participants are the voices, and we wanted to put what we learned from them into action. And we had community advisory councils that helped us do that. And at the end of the study, we also did a round of member checking, so going back to the participants and letting them know some of the things that we had found in their particular communities, and asking them if there's anything that we had missed or what else did we need to know, and getting their feedback on whether they thought that we had captured their realities.
Thank you. Okay, I'll start with your pop culture question, right? And this is what really got us thinking about doing this study back in 2012, because we were seeing so much advertising and so many messages, everything from breast is best and this is the best start you can be giving your child in life, to sort of these images that we see in commercials, right? And it's that mom, and usually she's a white middle class looking mom, right, who's just happily serving her child some meal that she's just whipped up. And this has created a lot of Absolutely. Right. The celebrity cooking shows, right? Like it's all sort of amping up. So the question sociologists ask is, why now? Why are these standards amping up right now? And there's some really interesting answers to that, and it's a complex issue. But what I will say quickly is that if you can manufacture anxiety and discontent, you can make a lot of money, right? And so if you can convince people that, and this is just a part of the answer, but if you can convince people that what they're doing is wrong and the way that they're doing it is wrong, then you can step in with your products and your services, right? This is much like the dieting industry, to help them out. And we do have a problem with population health, so we don't want to minimize that at all. The question is, why are we focusing so much on mothers? Why are we putting the burden on their shoulders to solve this problem? So, one of the things we really wanted to do was to challenge this discourse that it's mothers who can solve some of our most pressing social problems. And what we realize when we do this research is that the problem is much bigger than mothers. It's much bigger than individual households, even though mothers play an amazing role in our society, but they alone can't solve this problem. But it's easy to focus on mothers or families and tell them, if you only do this, if you shop smarter, then you can eat better. If you do that, then you create a smokescreen, and we're not looking at some of these bigger issues like deep-seated inequalities that are causing much of the suffering.
I'll speak to your last question, which was about reaching out to public servants, politicians, and trying to enact change in the communities. And so, as Sarah mentioned before, we did have this large part of the project that focused on supporting communities and projects that they wanted to enact. And so that was certainly one aspect of it. We did have the opportunity to meet with some politicians, to do some local conferences, and Sarah and our other co-PI, who isn't here today, were invited to the White House to meet with Michelle Obama in her Let's Move initiative. And so we did do some of those, and I think we also really explicitly wrote our book in a way that we hoped was very accessible and would be read by a lot of people and reach a lot of people. We've had policymakers email us and thank us for defining the issue in such ways that really bring out people's humanity. And I think are using some of our work in order to advance more progressive agendas. And so it's always gratifying to hear that's going on. So those are just a few things that we've done to try to make impacts in our community.
Yeah, so when we were writing this book, I was in Sweden for that year on research leave. We're not allowed to call it sabbatical in North Carolina. And so I feel like we spent a lot of time, in part because of that, but Sinikka had moved to Canada by then, talking about how our findings, what were the commonalities across places and what were the ways that this really was a story of the United States. And speaking at least of Sweden, and I ended up doing interviews that were somewhat similar with mothers, they heard the same messages. They said a lot of the same things about how, it was better to cook from scratch, and they tried that. And they also expressed, I would say, a sense of stress and anxiety about getting it right. But I also saw it also made it clear how much we're expecting people to do it on their own. So, for example, all kids eat the school lunch in Sweden. It's a good lunch. I mean, most people think you can't really opt out. And most of the I think almost everyone felt like that was helping their kids eat a little better. Like it's exposing them to new foods and helping them learn to eat vegetables. So that was one thing that they didn't have to, they were not Googling like school lunch bento box recipes at the beginning of September. They weren't worrying about the quality of the school lunch. And then time. I was just reading a book on the plane over here that's analyzing time use in the Nordic countries. And they're actually cooking they're cooking more, and they're eating more family meals than they were 15 years ago. And we are possibly cooking a little bit more, but the jump has been bigger there. And I think and also the other thing is that men are cooking more in Nordic countries, which is true here too, than they were 20 years ago. And there's no class variation there. And I think that is also public policies, more paid leave for both fathers and mothers. And these have made a difference. And in some cases in just one generation. So I think, although sometimes it feels impossible to imagine like any positive change, you can make a difference pretty quickly if you can actually get something done.
So we had a question about community dinners and how realistic this is as a solution. And I appreciate this, and I have struggled with this as well. And I will say that one of the things that we saw happening in the area where we did this research was that these community dinners were often being held in churches. And they formed an important part of the kind of outreach and support and community that churches have historically played in the South. And they were well attended. And I remember talking to a mother who said, "You go and it's $5, and that's optional, and the kids really get a good meal and they enjoy it." In my neighborhood, which was a downtown historic neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina, there was a community supper at a local church I could walk to. And it was the same idea that you go and people were drawing people, and they also had a homeless shelter there. And so they were encouraging these kinds of conversations to go on within these community suppers. It didn't always work beautifully, but it worked pretty well. And it created a different environment about what it meant to be neighbors and what it meant to be a community. Now that I'm in Canada, we have neighborhood houses, and these are government-supported projects that are all around the communities, and they're designed to be a hub for neighborhoods to draw people in. They have commercial kitchens, and they often have people coming in to cook and serve food, and there's a real sense that this is what we do. This is how we show that we're a community. And so I was probably the naysayer amongst the three of us, and I think I've been wooed by this idea to an extent, but I appreciate that it may not be for everyone. How realistic it is. Yeah, well, I think it's just one of them, and I think also we can't just say that that's not going to fix everything. And so at the same time, we need to give parents more control over their time. We need to make people have a living wage. We need to ensure the kinds of supports so that families aren't feeling so anxious and pressured all the time.
And just to add one thing, I don't think, well, the important point that this is not in itself a solution, but I also don't think it necessarily has to be like an organized community meal. But one of the things that's hard about feeding children, especially, I think, is that it feels very isolating. And, some of the moms did eat with others. And this was poor and working class mom. It was poor and working class moms, maybe more than the middle class moms. But that was help with the food, but also, a sense that you're not in it by yourself. So I think it can happen within families. It can happen, within neighborhoods too. And sometimes it's not really about the food. It's just to have someone there with you in it together.
Reciprocity. You could say a little bit more about how you feel that
Sure. The question is about reciprocity and how participants might have benefited. We spent a lot of time thinking about this at the beginning of the study. And so we did pay folks to be involved in this study. And so in year one for the interviews, they were getting paid $25. We also asked folks to do food recalls, and they were getting paid additional monies for each of these. And we also paid folks the smaller subset of 12 families who participated in the ethnographic observations. We were going over to their homes 10 times in the course of a month. And so, but this raised a lot of questions, and as a research team, we talked about this, namely, is this exploitation? What are we doing here, right? We had some really honest conversations about this. If you have people who are living on the economic margins, and you have folks like us who aren't, well, I was a graduate student at the time, but for all intents and purposes, we weren't. What does it mean to say, hey, here, well, I'll give you $500 if you come and let me watch you in your home, during the course of this month? And so we wondered, are people just desperate, and is that why they're saying yes to this? And what does that mean if they're saying yes out of desperation, right? So we tried to, as a way to try to, deal with those power dynamics and this thorny issue, we would talk a lot about this is voluntary. Even if as we approached them, we said, even if you don't want to do this, that's fine. You'll still get to keep participating in the 5-year study. And we tried to give them as much information as possible. This is exactly what we're asking you to do. This is the nature of it. This is when we're going to pay you. This is how this is going to work. So they could make as much of an informed decision as possible. All of the families we approached did agree. Nobody said they didn't want to. And so we tried to be as aware of this as possible. And it's difficult in research when you're paying participants.
Going back to what you were talking about with Scandinavian countries and how they have standardized school lunches and going up beyond the scope of food, but with longer maternity leave, in some cases paid higher education. And that sounds amazing, but it's a much smaller population. So how do you think that would transfer over to a country with much larger population, and especially a country that values personal freedoms?
Yeah. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think the thing I've thought a lot about is that and I think the school lunch is a good example of this, that sometimes having better collective supports means that it's not exactly what you want for your individual family. And so, and I think that even among progressive people in the United States, sometimes they want the public supports, but I think we have this kind of American mentality that I want it the way I want it for my kids, and I should have the right to be able to do that at all times. And so the school lunches, I just read that the Austin School District is trying to get parents to opt in to the public school lunch, parents that can afford to opt out, because that's better for everyone. And so I think about, what if we had universal school lunch in the US? What we would not probably have is that everyone has to take it. And I think that opens up possibilities to integrate it into the educational system, to make it more sustainable. It's better for everyone if everyone opts in. But I interviewed this mom in Sweden, and she talked about how on Thursdays it was always soup day. And so they ate soup for lunch, and her kids didn't really like soup. And so what she did was she just made them a really big snack when they got home. And she was fine with that. She's like, they don't really like soup. They come home hungry. I make something. But I think in the United States, I don't know if we could handle that. We'd be like, my kid does not like soup. I need to send the sandwich. And so I think that is, in addition to debating, how can we support these things? And people in Sweden pay higher taxes, but it's actually it's not nearly as high as we imagine compared to ours. And they get a lot of things for it that is not tied to employment, which I think has major implications. But in addition to that part of it, which is a huge part, I think we would need to kind of collectively come to terms with sometimes opting in means believing in the collective enough to believe in it, even if you feel like it's not exactly what you want for your kids or your family. But it's a great question.
And just to add to that, I think that one of the things that we're seeing in the Scandinavian countries that they're not doing so well is dealing with immigration and issues around racism and xenophobia, which we see in the US. And so I think at the same time, we need to have a strategy that thinks about us as a collective, and that resists these kinds of narratives that seek to divide us and to stratify us on the basis of race or nationhood. And that's an issue I think that's been a longstanding one in the U.S. But I think that one thing I like about the U.S. is that it has often shown itself as capable of approaching something with a new and a fresh way. And so I have optimism that potentially we could overcome that issue here.
I just have a comment and then perhaps another question. Just a comment to the woman at the front and I think to the young woman here who was talking about dinners and just the food opportunity of doing collective dinners. I do some work, I've done some work in the Northwest region as well as here in the Twin Cities. And I've seen these community dinners occur. In fact, there is an indigenous community up in actually Bemidji with their community development center, where they actually have their community dinners at least once a week, and it's a cultural experience. And so part of this gets into something that you mentioned also within your talk, which is really about the cultural exchange as well as the cultural experience of dinner and food being a part of that connection. I've also seen it here in the Twin Cities with the Hmong community and certainly the African American community as it relates to particular issues that occur within those communities. And so if there's a particular thing that happens, dinners are always a part of that experience. And so that also becomes an opportunity to engage and to provide food. I think that this is where, when we think about schools, and I love the idea of thinking about when we're talking about school lunch, but I also think about the idea of schools, and I know people like, I want to say, I'm forgetting his last name now, educator reformer. Anyway, he talks about schools as a community center, particularly urban communities, right? And so that they become more than just schools, but they also become opportunities for families to come together. It actually becomes an opportunity to provide health information and as well as an opportunity to bring families and communities together. And that's where food would also be provided. So I just wanted to just say that because I do think that there are some things that are happening right here in the Twin Cities and in the state that lends itself to this idea of providing food for families and young people in non-traditional ways. That's actually a part of a cultural experience that's being done.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in fact, one of the foodie edicts we had was food brings people together. And that's one that we found really resonated with our participants. And we end the book with that section because it does talk about immigrant communities using food to maintain cultural ties, to build networks, and to pass on immigrant identities. And we talk about using food to reintegrate families who have been affected by mass incarceration in the U.S. And so we see food as also helping people to be resilient, to form communities, and to do this kind of cultural outreach that you talk about. So I really appreciate your comment. Thank you.
I wonder, could you say a little bit more? I know you touched on a little bit about religious communities and churches. And I guess it strikes me in a certain sense that those are some communities that do an awful lot with community meals and food. And on the material side, you mentioned it kind of in passing, but in terms of well-funded and supported kitchens in a lot of neighborhoods. So any more on that you could shed light on would be I think, interesting to hear. I didn't mean to pick on you.
No, I think so. Our colleague, our co-PI, who's not here, she's at NC State, but she got her degree is religion and public health, so she really brought that lens to it. So we had a big focus on faith communities, and in all of the neighborhoods in our study, both in Raleigh, which was a historically African American neighborhood that had a lot of churches that were very important and had been there for a long time, and in these rural communities where they really didn't have a lot of other community. I mean, they had some, but churches were a huge resource. Most of the food most of the food pantries in that area, they were in the churches. And then there were also these community meal programs. And so I think they were an important resource, like what the paper that Annie is working on that we're part of, but she's kind of leading, is how these messages about faith and morality, how the services the churches provide also intertwine with some of the messages they provide. And sometimes that's positive, and like your body is a temple, and maybe it can be a positive way of looking at every person's value, including with food, but sometimes it can be negative and about shame and who is deserving and who is not. And these are all Christian churches, so it matters in places that there aren't a lot of resources besides that. But I think that we did end up doing a lot of work with churches, and they were very important resources in lots of ways in all of these places.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was great. I wanted to ask about the possibility of kind of the street level bureaucrats that your families dealt with. So people that, maybe like the physician assistant who weighed the children for WIC eligibility, or the social workers, or even the, middle or elderly church ladies who in the food banks kind of managed the distribution of goods. Like, might there be room for intervention there? On the one hand, they're kind of enacting the will of the state, perhaps, or these structural forces, but on the other hand, many of them are much closer in terms of their daily struggles to the families that you interviewed. And so I wonder if you talked to those groups after the book, or what you think about that possibility.
That's a great question. I think some of those WIC visits still haunt me. I went on a couple of them. I was with Melanie Richards the day that she went to the WIC office, and I was also with Patricia Washington. And one of the things that struck me about Patricia's case was that they were there to recertify, and so by the time we got in to talk with the nutritionist, she had a checklist in front of her, and she didn't even really look up, and she's like, daughter's eating well, getting plenty of fruits and vegetables, like, and Patricia knew the game too. She was like, right. And by the time we left, I realized that that staff member didn't know that they were living in a hotel room, right. And so that's these are some really big assumptions that folks are making, and my mom used to work for WIC for almost a decade, right. And so I really sympathize with sort of the volume of clientele and some of the really difficult issues that they're facing. But yes, some of this sort of training and cultural awareness and could be happening at those levels that would really help. I mean, I think that Melanie Richards and her whole experience with, for folks who don't know that chapter in the book, she had taken her daughter in, and her daughter had to get weighed, and Melanie herself would be, clinically defined as obese, and she was made to get on the scale as well, and she tried to get out of it, and the WIC staff member said, no, mom has to get on the scale too. And it was just this like incredibly humiliating moment, especially for Melanie, who took such pride in the fact that she knew a lot about nutrition, and she was trying to impart that to her children. And I don't think that staff member realized the level of shame that was happening. So I think there's probably some fairly effective kinds of interventions we could be doing about creating this sort of awareness, or asking people the right kinds of questions in these sort of encounters, and that would go a long way.
So I think we have time for one more question. Tracy, do you want to wind us up? I see. Oh, there you. Oh, okay.
There's a very strong relationship between food insecurity and land, but for the people in the study, I assume were renting as well, so they have to pay rent to a certain class. And at the same time, it seems that the way that
You left the hard question for the end. Thank you so much. So this is a wonderful question. So this is this issue of if we just continue to rely on the market or the government to solve some of these food issues, then we're not really addressing some of the core challenges around food production and consumption. So in the book, we have a lot of other solutions we talk about, and one of them is to enact a guaranteed income. And so we know that there are many experiments, natural and simply policy-based, where states and municipalities have enacted the guaranteed income and have found that it did mean that people had more time for things that mattered to them, like caregiving. And at the same time, it didn't seem to diminish people's productivity the way some people are concerned about, and which I don't think you would be concerned about, but the naysayers are concerned about, and so you have to address that. And so that might be one proposal that gives people more opportunities to do with their time what supports them and their families, as opposed to feeling as though they are working for the market and don't have a lot of choices around how they use and organize their time. And I think that there are some really great things going on as well if we want to think about these extractive forms of food production that are happening. That Sarah might be able to speak to better than I can, since she has more of a history of this kind of food research. But do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question about the role of the food industry, and it's one that we've gotten some pushback on. And I think we would all agree, like, the food industry is not off the hook, and our focus on, not judging home cooking as a moral issue and not judging ethical consumption as a question of who is and is not a good person, like, does not detract from the fact that we need to hold the food companies accountable. And one of the things we talk about is marketing to children, for example, where lots of countries have lots of regulations around this, and we really don't. About your question about food production, most of the people in our study did not grow their own food, but I think about a quarter to a third did. And these were, not surprisingly, mostly in rural areas. They were disproportionately immigrants, a lot of whom had come from rural areas, farming backgrounds, and then that was, and I think it was, so for a lot of people, that wasn't really a viable strategy, and they hadn't even grown up with it in their families. But for the families that had it, it was a way to sort of buffer, as you say, against these hard times, because they had chickens or they had a garden. So at least they had that, or they hunted. That was something for some families. And then for some of the immigrant families, it was also one of the only ways that they could grow, like Joslyn was talking about, that they could get the chilies. And this changed over time, but especially like when they first had moved to the United States, there weren't as many immigrant communities in North Carolina. So that was the only way to get some of these ingredients. So that was sustaining to some of these families, but not all of them for sure.
Well, the hardest part of this job is to say we have to cut off the conversation, but let's thank our speakers, and I hope we'll see you same time, same place next week for Philology. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.